Frank Sisson. I'm from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. This event this evening is organized by the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium, which is a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta and funded by the Temirtay Foundation. It is also sponsored by the Petro Yatsyk Program for the Study of Ukraine, part of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Fortunately, this evening, there are not another long list usually we have of sponsors, but we are grateful to those sponsors for making this event possible. I might add, for those of you interested in talks on Ukraine, please look at the Peter Yatsyk or Petro Yatsyk program website on the Munk Center at CIRIS. There are a number of talks coming up, one of which is on the back of your program, which is the Toronto Annual Ukrainian Famine Lecture, which will be given by Yars Balan, Tell the Kremlin We Are Starving, Rhea Kleiman's 1932 Odyssey Through the Famine Lands of Ukraine. It's about a Toronto journalist who in 1932 traveled to Ukraine and was expelled from the Soviet Union. That event will be taking place on the 28th of November, and please register if you would like to take part in it. I might add another event coming up on November the 8th at the Munk Center will be a book launch of a volume of the history of Mikhailo Hrushevsky's History of Ukraine Rus, a project that is put out by the center that I head, the Peter Yatsyk Center for Ukrainian Historical Research. The topic is connected to this evening's lecture in that Mikhailo Hrushevsky was not only Ukraine's foremost historian, but he was also the first president of an independent Ukrainian state, modern state, in 1918. We are going through the year of 1917's 100th anniversary and going to be moving towards the proclamation of Ukrainian statehood. And I will think after you hear the remarks by our speaker today, Anne Applebaum, you'll see how closely related the issues of the attempt to form an independent Ukrainian state and the Holodomor are. Our format this evening will be a discussion with a number of questions for about 30 to 40 minutes, then to be followed by questions from the audience, and then to be followed, when each of you purchases your book, the possibility to have our author sign the book. So that will be the approximate format. The questions will be posed by Marta Baziuk, who is executive director of, as we call it, HREC, the Holodomor Research and Educational Consortium. Marta holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. She earlier worked at the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard University, and indeed was very much involved with publicity and discussions surrounding Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Sorrow, that also dealt with the famine of Ukraine. She has been professionally involved in Ukraine since its independence. In the lead up to Ukraine's first post-independence parliamentary election in 1994, Marta ran civic programs in Ukraine for the National Democratic Institute of International Affairs and worked with Ukrainian civic activists to establish a national election monitoring organization, the Nonpartisan Committee of Voters of Ukraine. A country representative in Ukraine for Winrock International, Marta worked to establish a network of centers that provide services to women, including job skills, training, and hotlines for victims of domestic violence, all part of a project to prevent the trafficking of women. For the last 5 years, she has been the executive director of HREC, and I think many of you who have come to the famine lectures, the events sponsored by HREC, have seen how active she has been in promoting awareness of the famine in Ukraine. Of course, you have come to hear our esteemed and much welcome speaker, Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum was born in Washington, D.C. After graduating from Yale University, she was a Marshall Scholar at the LSE and St. Anthony's College of Oxford. From 1988 to 1991, she covered the collapse of communism as the Warsaw correspondent of The Economist magazine and the Independent newspaper. And what I have reflected here is a shift of career from an academic path onto a path that led Anne to Poland, a country which, in a way, she has become, found a second or third homeland, and a country about which she knows a great deal and reported on. She is a columnist for the Washington Post and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She is also professor of practice at the London School of Economics Institute of Global Affairs, where she runs ARENA, a program on disinformation and 21st century propaganda. Now, what I've outlined is three careers, one as a journalist, one as an academic, and one as a historian. As a journalist, she was a member of the Washington Post editorial board. She has also worked as the foreign and deputy editor of The Spectator magazine in London, as the political editor of the Evening Standard, and as a columnist at Slate and at several British newspapers, including the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs. The list of journals, magazines in which she has published is immense: Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, the International Herald Tribune, Foreign Affairs, New Criteria, the Weekly Standard, the New Republic, the National Review, the New Statesman, the Independent, the Guardian, Prospect, Die Welt, Cicero, Gazette Wyborcza, and it continues on and on. And so many of you, I think, have known her primarily as a journalist and reading her column in Washington Post. As an academic, she has lectured at Yale, Harvard, Columbia University, as well as Oxford, Cambridge, London, Belfast, Heidelberg, Maastricht, Zurich, Humboldt, and Texas A&M. In 2012-13, she held the Philip Roman Chair of History and International Relations at the London School of Economics. But above all, I think she is a historian, and she is a quite remarkable historian. She has written a trilogy of works on the Stalin period that I think has provided a new understanding of Stalinism and what it meant for Eastern Europe, for Russia, for the Soviet Union. And why do I find them so remarkable? Because she has given voice to the voiceless. That is, she has told the stories away from just studies of mass movements and statistics, although they have been important. She has moved away just from the study of the top of the political leadership and tried to tell us about society and people. And in that way, I think, has brought to many readers, and many readers outside of academia, an understanding of what these events meant for the people who lived through them, and how we can therefore better understand why they occurred and what their consequences have been. Above all, we know her as an author of Gulag, A History, which narrates the history of the Soviet concentration camp system and describes daily life in the camps, making extensive use of relatively recently opened Russian archives, as well as memoirs and interviews, which were tremendously important for making this book a book that reached a wider public. Gulag won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction in 2004. She has also written a book called Iron Curtain: The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. In doing so, she moved to the sphere that the Soviet Union took over after World War II, in what some referred to as a liberation and many referred to as an occupation. It describes the imposition of Soviet totalitarianism in Central Europe after the Second World War. It's a remarkable book I have found using with students because it is often hard for my students to understand how could this system, this totalitarian system, have triumphed? Why did societies go along with it? How did these countries so different, in the case of Poland and East Germany and Hungary, wind up with such similar structures and then different reactions to them? And above all, because she has been able to tell the stories of people who lived through it. And now she has turned to an event, a fundamental event for Ukrainian history. That is the Holodomor of 1932-33. Now, we are much distanced in time from that event. The survivors are relatively few already. Fortunately, there are elements of interviews, of testimonies of those who gathered it. But above all, there is a new possibility to look at the Holodomor from the time that Robert Conquest wrote his pioneering work in the early 1980s, published in 1986. Above all, the fall of the Soviet Union, the opening up of possibilities for Ukraine to have a voice and the people of Ukraine to have a voice and put their testimonies, and the opening up of the archives. And all of these have made it possible to have this revelatory book with a new approach to the Holodomor and its relationship in Ukrainian history, and a book, like all of her works, immensely readable. That is, a book which will reach a wide public. What I'd like to do is ask Martha Baziuk and Applebaum to please take seats, and they will begin a process of question, answer, and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Are our mics working in proper order? Yeah. So thank you, Frank. And it's good to be here with you tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. It's great to be back in Toronto.
Frank's comments touched on this, but we know you from your works, Gulag and Iron Curtain, works where you were immersed for years in, I think it's fair to say, very dark material. And you turn around and take on the subject of the Holodomor. There must have been something very compelling to you. I'm curious, why the Holodomor? What was it about the subject that led you to commit to what you knew would be a long, hard haul with another round with very dark material?
Thanks for that question. I think probably the way to start is to is to explain what situation the study of the Holodomor was in a few years ago. As Frank referred, many of you, this is of course a subject that was well known inside the Ukrainian community. It was a story that the story of the famine was passed down from grandparents to children. People inside Ukraine told the story. It was became almost an alternative history of Ukraine, but it wasn't really known to the general public, and it wasn't ever discussed publicly at all in Soviet Ukraine. Since 1991, we've had access to archives in Ukraine, not just in Ukraine actually, but initially in Moscow, although those have got harder to use now. And at the same time, the Ukrainian government undertook a mass project to collect all existing memoirs, testimonies, going province by province inside Ukraine, putting them together in volumes and publishing them in an attempt to put out the history of the famine. And I became aware a few years ago that we were really at a different stage with the famine, that this was now something that we weren't talking about what might have happened or what could have happened, but actually how it happened, and that there was really a timeline. We know which decisions Stalin took and when. We know what kinds of impact they had. And I thought that it was really the moment when it made sense to begin pulling these things together. I had, helping me write this, I had really a kind of generation of Ukrainian historians who'd been working on this. I had people like you at HREC here in Toronto, and your counterpart in in Kiev who'd been working on putting together the basic documents, and I saw that it was possible to tell the story differently. In a way, the archives don't really change the story. I mean, more or less, what people remembered is how things were, but they help you explain the story in a different way. So I'm not only telling the story from the perspective of the victims, but also from the perspective of the people who organized the famine. So it became possible to explain why and how it was organized. And that was the reason why I decided to do it at this moment, because I knew that it was a different kind of story. Contrary to what you might imagine, I was not affected by politics. In fact, I started working on the book in 2012 when Ukraine seemed to be, it wasn't interesting at all from a political perspective. Sorry, I know it's interesting always to many people in this room, but it wasn't an important player on the world stage. Nothing that exciting was happening there. And then naturally when 2014 happened, I actually became involved in writing about Ukraine and writing about the Russian invasion, partly because I was already working on the book, and I was therefore drawn into the subject. And so since then, obviously, the subject of Ukraine has become much more prominent as a part of geopolitics, really, not just regional politics. But that wasn't the reason for the book. The reason for the book was that I knew it was a story that could be told anew, and I thought there was the last time anybody had tried this was Bob Conquest in the 1980s, but he didn't have archives. Mm-hmm. So I thought it could be done again in an interesting way. I should say that the structure of the book is a little unexpected. The way I started writing it was that I began with 1932 and 33, reading through the documentation, the orders that Stalin gave, the letters that he was sending to his cronies, to Kaganovich and to others, thinking that what I was going to write was a book about 1932 and 1933. And as I said, I think maybe I said it to you jokingly, 2 years, one country, it can't be that hard a book to write, whereas my previous book was multiple countries and multiple years. But what I discovered was that in 1932, Stalin is talking obsessively about 1917 and 1918 and 1919. And he's referring back to the Civil War and to the events of the Civil War, which have, which he remains obsessed with. And if you think about it, this makes sense. I mean, he's a man in his, how old was he then, in his 50s or 60s? And to him, the Civil War, which was 15 years earlier, wasn't that long ago. And he remembers it, and he is still remembering it. And of course, Stalin's experience of the Civil War was very, he spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. And so in 1932, he is obsessive about a new rebellion that he expects from Ukraine. He's remembering all the violence and chaos of 1918. He's remembering that the near collapse of Ukraine in those years almost led to an invasion, or did lead, sorry, to an invasion from the White Armies. He remembered that this is the closest the Bolsheviks came to losing the Soviet Union, so he's obsessed about how to prevent this Ukrainian national movement from rising again. So, I wrote it because the documents were available, and then the documents led me to structuring the book in a way that it's really a book about Ukraine from 1917 to 1932.
And as you were writing, I imagine that you were talking about the progress of the book with some of your colleagues, many of whom are considered experts in Soviet history. What did you find they were most surprised by or resistant to? What did you have to convince them of? And what were you came in knowing quite a bit, but what were you surprised by that you didn't know or didn't expect in the research?
Well, the central question about the famine, which has always been an odd story in historiography, because everybody sort of knew there was a famine. It's not a secret. But because Stalin had so obsessively repressed it, because nobody was allowed to talk about it, because it was never mentioned, even, for example, in Khrushchev's famous secret speech after Stalin dies, he makes a speech essentially accusing Stalin of having misled the Soviet Union. He actually doesn't mention Ukraine or the famine. He talks about other things, the purges of the party and so on. So it wasn't a crime that ever ranked very high in anybody's memory. And of course, intellectuals in Moscow and others who came to write Soviet history didn't really remember it either, because it mostly affected the peasants. And so what I didn't know when I was starting out writing the book was to what degree was this really a Ukrainian famine, And to what degree was it just the result of the chaos of collectivization? So those of you who know Soviet history know that in the late 1920s, Stalin began, worrying that the peasants weren't producing enough grain, and his logic led him to he thought, well, and there was even a series of statements and speeches he gives in which he says, well, the peasants I can see that one of the problems is that their farms are too small, they need bigger farms, but of course we don't want any big private farms here, so we have to have collective farms. And he makes a decision to do that. He organizes collectivization. This is all over the Soviet Union, not just Ukraine. And collectivization is almost a second revolution in the Russian countryside. And so with collectivization, they force peasants off their land, but they also confiscate churches, they melt church bells, they arrest priests. The point of collectivization is to change the social structure of the countryside, to remove the peasants who are a kind of, were a force, were a social class who had not been entirely convinced that the Bolshevik Revolution was good for them. And so he wants to proletarianize them, make them into a kind of a working class who work on state farms. They're not individuals, they don't own their own land, they work for the state. And there was tremendous resistance to this. And of course, the result of this resistance and the chaos that collectivization called really was the famine. And so in 1931 and 1932, you can talk about a famine caused by chaos. But the degree to which this chaos was worrying and upsetting for Stalin is something only recently people have begun to understand. As the famine gets worse and worse, all kinds of people begin writing to Stalin from all over the countries, including other senior Bolsheviks, saying, this is a disaster, it's terrible, people are starving. Stalin's wife kills herself in the autumn of 1932, and while we don't, of course, know why she kills herself, one of the things that was said at the time was that she killed herself because of the famine. The impression that this is a disastrous policy, it's gone terribly wrong, and also that it's really an undermining of everything that the Bolsheviks said they were in favor of, right? I mean, they came to power, they said, we're going to give power to the workers and the peasants, we're going to create a paradise on earth for them, they're going to be the victors, and yet instead the opposite is happening, and they are starving to death. And this is such a it's such a disaster that there's even a moment when there begins to be inside the Bolshevik leadership a small revolt against Stalin, the Ryutin movement it was called, and people begin signing petitions and meeting secretly, isn't this the time to get rid of them? And Stalin, at this point, in the autumn of 1932, he sees there's this chaotic thing happening all over the Soviet Union, but instead of retreating, instead of alleviating the famine, instead of asking for foreign aid, for example, as had done, as not he, but as the Bolsheviks had done a decade earlier when there was an earlier famine in 1920, instead of releasing the peasants from their obligations, instead of continuing to collect grain from them for the cities, instead of halting exports, which they were then exporting, he makes a decision to widen and deepen the famine, specifically in Ukraine. And this is the moment when he begins talking about, Petlurists, the Ukrainian. The Petlura was one of the Ukrainian national leaders during the Civil War. He begins worrying about the intervention of Poland, that the Poles are somehow manipulating the Ukrainians. And this is, again, an echo of the Civil War when the Polish army played a role. And they pass a series of decrees in the autumn of 1932 which blacklist Ukrainian villages and towns, so that they are not able not only to receive food, but they can't even receive things like salt and manufactured goods. They establish a cordon around Ukraine so that people are not allowed to leave the republic. They stop what was called Ukrainianization, so programs in which people were allowed to speak the Ukrainian language. They bring that to an end. And finally, at the height of this moment, when people were already very hungry, they send teams of searchers from house to house and in Ukrainian villages, and they take all of their food. So this isn't just grain, and it's not just wheat. It's corn, beans, squash, peas, fruit, anything that people have, and they remove their food from their houses, and then they set up roadblocks between the villages and the cities, and that's how people starve. So in other words, this is a famine inside Ukraine that's not caused by chaos. It's not caused by collectivization. It's not caused by drought. It's not caused by the weather. It's not caused by pestilence or the other things that usually cause famines. It's caused because people have removed the food from the peasants and then allowed them to starve to death. And understanding that mechanism is something that's not featured in most Soviet history books. It's not something people have studied much. It's something that comes from both the memoir evidence and also from the new archival evidence, which is, has been more confined to Ukrainian and Ukrainian language studies than other subjects. And I don't know to what degree it's really filtered up through the historical community. I mean, it is. I'm sure it's beginning to. But that, I suppose, is that's the piece missing from traditional histories of the Soviet Union. Again, the famine is often there, but it's underemphasized. It's not considered. It's not as important or as exciting to classic historians as the purges, which take place a few years later. It's not as dramatic as World War II, so it's an earlier story. But I think with new archives and with what we can now write about it, it's possible to write differently about it. And so the understanding that it was a planned famine, that it was an artificial famine, and that in that sense it was a genocide, is something I think we can now say.
And in writing this full history of the Holodomor, it's clear that part of the story is why we don't know more about it. Could you say a little bit about why the Holodomor isn't better known? And I'm thinking about your chapter that discusses Gareth Jones and why the world, I think it's hard for people to, if something happened on a scale, why is it we don't know about it?
So, it was a lot easier to cover things up in the 1930s than it is now, and that's, of course, part of the story. But so, as I said already, Stalin forbade any discussion of the famine. Actually, the word famine is not used in the Soviet Union to discuss publicly, to discuss what happened in the 1930s ever, actually. I mean, Stalin stops using it, and it's never mentioned again. The famine is never mentioned in public until, I think the first time it's mentioned in Ukraine is in the late 1980s after the Chernobyl disaster, when a Ukrainian poet made a famous speech in which he compared the silence around Chernobyl, which was kept secret for 3 weeks, to the silence around the famine, and he talks about how this is a threat.
Was that Ivan Drac?
It was Ivan Drac, yes. That's in the book as well. But another piece of the story is Stalin's attempt to cover it up abroad. He was somebody who cared a lot about how he was perceived and how his country was perceived. He thought of himself as the leader of the world revolution, and he expected that revolution to spread to other countries. And so actually the impact and the echo of the Soviet Union abroad mattered to him in a way that can sometimes be surprising. He cared what foreign writers wrote about the Soviet Union and so on. And the cover-up of the famine is also quite apart from the impact it had on how what we remember, is also a very interesting story about journalism and how journalism works. As most of the Moscow correspondents at that time were very dependent on the Soviet government to do their jobs. They weren't allowed to stay in Moscow unless they had permission. Everything that they wrote was censored when it was sent abroad. So in order to stay in good, good standing in Moscow, you had to be careful what you wrote. And the foreign ministry of the Soviet Union made clear they didn't want anybody writing about the famine. And one correspondent who was there at the time said, well, of course, everybody knew there was a famine. It was like, how could you not? There were food shortages in Moscow itself. And it was like not knowing that it snows in the winter. I mean, it was just a part of life. We all knew that there were bad things happening in the countryside, but nobody wrote about it. One exception was a very young Welsh journalist called Gareth Jones, who I like him because he was a kind of freelance writer, which is actually how I started being a journalist, and so he's an appealing character. He somewhat wangled his way to Moscow. He was then a kind of junior private secretary to Lloyd George, who had been the Prime Minister of Britain. And I think he kind of advertised himself as being more important than he was, and so he got a special visa. He got to Moscow. The Soviet government was very nice to him, and they allowed him to travel to Kharkiv, which was then the capital of Ukraine. And most people weren't at that time being allowed to travel to Kharkiv. But he walked around Moscow, he met a lot of people, and then he got on this train to Kharkiv. And he He got on the train, and then about halfway to Kharkiv, he got off the train, and he started walking down the train tracks. He knew there was a famine, so he knew that what he was going to see. And he was walking down the train tracks in Ukraine in March of 1933, which is the height of the famine. So if you think these searches take place in the winter, autumn and winter of 1932, sort of December, January, February 1932. So by March, you begin to have people dying. And he sees it, and he marches through down the tracks. He keeps very extensive notebooks, which were almost miraculously preserved, and which have recently been republished by somebody who's sitting in the front row tonight, Mr. Lutyuk. And he preserved the notebooks and took notes, saw what was happening, understood that people were starving, wrote down people's quotes, and then I think was eventually picked up by the Soviet secret police in one of the villages who bundled him back on the train and made him go to Kharkiv, and he spent a couple of days there, and then he left the country, and then he went to Berlin and held a press conference. And at this press conference, he said, there's a mass famine in Russia, people and Ukraine. People are starving. The numbers are very high. And he read from his notebooks. He said, this is what's happening. And he had several quite prominent journalists in the room who then wrote stories based on his testimony. Later on, he wrote several articles in different parts of the British press, again, describing from his notebooks what he'd seen and what he thought was happening. And that might have won some attention, except that there was another journalist based in Moscow who was much more important at that time and much more senior than Gareth Jones, and this was the New York Times correspondent, Walter Duranty. And Duranty was, of course, like the other journalists in Moscow, dependent on the goodwill of the Soviet government, but also something a little bit more than that. He had won a Pulitzer Prize a couple of years before, lauding the Soviet government, saying how wonderful collectivization was, how well it was all going. And he, I'm guessing, there have been lots of speculation about it, but I'm guessing it was reasons of vanity. He didn't want to let this Gareth Jones story undermine his narrative. And his narrative about the Soviet Union, he was not a left-wing, he was a kind of realist. His narrative about the Soviet Union was, this is a very interesting experiment, it's going awfully well, and there are things we can learn from it. And this view, by the way, was very popular at the time in the West, particularly in the United States, where we had the Great Depression, there was an economic disaster, and people were looking to the Soviet Union for some hope. So what are they doing? What do they understand? They understand something we don't, and Walter Duranty became a very famous public figure because he was bringing news from this exciting new experiment. And that there was this terrible catastrophe would have undermined all of his reporting. Mm-hmm. So he wrote a famous article, which is reprinted in the book. The title was, "Russians are hungry but not starving." And in the article, he explicitly mentions Gareth Jones. He said, well, he's a nice young man, he's very patronizing, but nice, so good of him to have learned Russian, it's very impressive. But he, has only seen a little part of this great country, and he's missed the big story, and this is not true. And this denial of the famine, think about the times. Gareth Jones was a young journalist, he was a freelancer. Walter Duranty was the correspondent for the New York Times in Moscow, very famous, friend of Roosevelt, very well known. And so, Walter Duranty's version won. I mean, that was the version that people accepted as Walter Duranty says there's no famine, then there's no famine. And that was the narrative that won. I mean, the interesting thing for me now is that, 80 years later, you have a reversal whereby Duranty is now actually pretty well known. He's actually a byline in some journalist circles for a journalist who's lied. Mm-hmm. And he, people are always campaigning to have his Pulitzer taken away. There was actually a big campaign a few years ago, and I know the Pulitzer Committee actually discussed it, and I think you'll be amused to know the decision was not to take it away, mostly because they started looking at who else had won Pulitzers. And it was some other awful people. And so, we couldn't, once you take one away, then there's a principle you have to take other people's away, so they gave up. Whereas Gareth Jones is now, I wouldn't say that he's a famous person, but he's he's well known in Wales. There are documentary films made about him. His biography has been written. He's revived I've just learned here in Toronto that there may be a film made about him, directed by Agnieszka Holland, a famous Polish film director. So it took about 80 years, but their reputations have since reversed.
But I would just add, it's not just that Duranty's version won out. It's the insertion of another narrative that just leaves people shrugging their it's like disinformation today. Which leads me to my next question. You have said before that there are parallels between how Stalin viewed Ukraine as an existential threat and Putin's views, and how far can you take the parallels?
So you have to be careful with these parallels. The present isn't the past, and lots of things are different, and I don't think Putin is Stalin, and so on. But I do think that the way in which Stalin saw Ukraine not as just another province and not as just another place that caused him trouble sometimes, but as really as an existential threat. You know, if things went badly in Ukraine, that could bring down the whole Soviet Union. And this was both because Ukraine had the grain that the Soviet Union needed, but also because Ukraine is genuinely closely related to Russia. The languages are related, the histories are intertwined. Kiev and Rus, the ancient kingdom that both countries trace their origins to, was held in common. And you know, if the Ukrainians had rejected Soviet communism, then lots of other people would have said, well, if the Ukrainians don't want it, there must really be something wrong with it. And I think he felt that he couldn't allow Ukraine to go a different path from Russia. And there's something of that in the way that Putin talks about Ukraine now. You know, it's not just, he could let the Baltic states go, he could let Poland go, he could probably let Tajikistan go, but Ukraine is something he feels much more strongly about. And again, I think it's for similar reasons. You know, when Putin looked at the Maidan in 2014 and he saw, all those young people calling for democracy and rule of law and denouncing corruption and waving the European flag, what he saw was a movement that could happen next in Moscow to him. And so this was a direct threat to him. It was exactly the kind of revolution that he's afraid of in Russia. And that, it was unacceptable that you could have that kind of revolution in Ukraine. And hence this, actually, in retrospect, overreaction, first the annexation of Crimea, and then the invasion of eastern Ukraine, which I don't think has been successful. It's a messy, drawn out, increasingly actually even in Russia unpopular intervention. But I think it's indicative of the degree to which he felt that Ukraine cannot be allowed to have its own politics. It cannot be allowed to integrate with Europe. It can't have a different system from Russia, because that's then a challenge for him. And by the way, I don't mean it would be bad for Russians, because for most Russians, having a prosperous European Ukraine would be good. I mean, there'd be more trade and it would be a more stable neighbor. But for the autocratic elite that runs Russia, this is an ideological challenge, because what could undermine them would be, any move towards something like democracy or rule of law would be very bad for Putin himself. And so I think that's the parallel that you can see between the two, their attitudes towards one another.
Well, and with that in mind, when you write a book, any of your 3 books, do you have a goal beyond recording a full and accurate history? And I guess I'm asking, what impact do you hope Red Famine will have?
So I genuinely believe that you can't really understand the present unless you understand the past and unless you understand what came before. I mean, almost everything the environment that we live in and the attitudes that we have and the societies we inhabit are shaped by the actions of our predecessors. And so my books are, my books actually, I talked about archives, but actually my books are almost always an attempt, usually they start as my attempt to explain something to myself. So why is it the way it is? Why was the Soviet Union the way it was? That led me to write the Gulag book. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989, as you heard from the wonderfully extended biography that Frank told. And when I watched, one country after another reject communism, and that made me think, well, and everybody agreed that this was a great thing. So, okay, why then? How did they become communist in the first place? And explaining what it was that had allowed those regimes to succeed helped me then understand what I'd seen. And this book is also an attempt to explain and understand a country that is often misunderstood, hasn't had, partly because it didn't have its own state until 1991, hasn't had the, hasn't been able to tell its own story for a long time. And so I hope the book will will help that. I mean, my books also, I do like to let, as much as possible, the people who are in the story tell their own story. And as Frank said, I like to use interviews and I like to use memoirs so that it's not just me speaking and telling you what happened, it's also the people who were there telling you what happened. And I think particularly in the 2 chapters that actually describe your period of starvation, that I tried to let I organized the testimony, but I tried to let people speak for themselves. And I think that helps you, helps the reader get somebody else's perspective, see the world in a different way. And that's also, I think, what I'd like to achieve.
Well, if you were not one person but could clone yourself, I mean, at some point you're writing a
Would
book.
have thought.
You have to finish it, and you could keep researching. What are the areas that you think are rich to continue to research? What isn't done yet in the study of the Holodomor? What do you wish you could continue with?
So there are a lot of things that one could do. I mean, one of the most interesting things about the Holodomor that hasn't really been worked on is how it affected different ethnic communities inside Ukraine. I'm often asked about Jews during the Holodomor, and the answer, as far as I know, as far as I was able to work on it, was that most of them weren't farmers, and generally speaking, the famine affected people who were farmers. And there are a number of anecdotal stories about Jews, Jewish doctors, Jews, who were in the villages, sometimes helping peasants, which I would have liked to go further with. So there are stories like that. I mean, I think there's still more to be written about the Ukrainian Communist Party, which was very divided. Quite a lot of Ukrainian communists protested against the famine, and quite a lot of them were purged or fired in the immediate aftermath of the famine because they hadn't been sufficiently enthusiastic about collectivization and about these searches of the peasants, and kind of understanding who they were and who quit and who stayed in the party would be interesting. That's really a story about perpetrators and collaborators, and there's more work that could be done on them. There's also a very good PhD thesis that I know is being written, but I hope will be a really great book one day, which is looking at these search teams, who was on them, who took part in them, and then what happened to those people afterwards. And my colleague who's working on this subject, Daria Mattingly, who's an academic in Britain, has discovered that many of the people who were on the search, in the activist groups, later wound up as village councilors, sort of leaders of the local Soviet, of the local council, and became the kind of village elite in subsequent years, and not only them but their children.
Yeah.
And so that the long-term aftermath, the long impact of a divisive experience like that, and how that's something that I think could probably still use more research too.
And you mentioned the importance of the voices of the witnesses and survivors in your work. Now that there's some distance, you finished the book, it's published. What are some of the stories that stay with you most? This book has it has a lot of awful, difficult stories. Almost always, and I found this when I wrote my Gulag book as well, all the worst stories are about children. And people, and by the way, why people collaborate and why people go along with terrible things like this is also often about children. If you want to feed your children, you will do almost anything. And so there are many people who would have joined search teams or joined the government or joined the party in order to make sure their families had food. I found that in the book about the 1940s in Eastern Europe was very similar. The thing that persuaded many intellectuals to remain silent was this fear that their children would be kicked out of school. This was think about how much effort you put into raising your child and how important it is to keep them in school or keep them studying, get them to university. But in this book, the worst stories are about, there are horrible stories about people who couldn't bear to hear their children crying or asking for food, and so they would put them outside or away from the house so that they wouldn't watch them die. There are terrible cannibalism stories. Usually these are about people who go mad. One of the things that happens to you when you become hungry is that there are different stages that you go through.
And some of the final stages are a form of madness. I mean, people almost cease to be human. They are unable to, remember who are their relatives. They're unable to identify people. They will previously law-abiding, family-loving, warm people become thieves. They become murderers. The transformation of the of the personality that takes place under the famine. I think those are the things that that stay with me. I mean, this was a very hard book to write because there's really no uplifting testimony from that period. There's no, the Gulag memoirs. They're people who were wonderful writers and intellectuals who lived through the camps and were then able to write in extraordinary ways about it afterwards and tell stories and so on. This is really, this was a story of mostly very poor people, sometimes illiterate people, dying of hunger. And there's no redeeming moment where you think, well, people have learned something. Really, no, nobody learns anything.
And the genocide paradigm that you've got perpetrators and victims and bystanders, it doesn't seem to me there were bystanders.
There aren't any really bystanders. Even perpetrators, you have to talk about degrees of who's a perpetrator, because I said many of the so-called perpetrators were people who were also very hungry, and some of them died later on. So it's which also, by the way, is something they have in common with other genocides. That's not unusual. I mean, neighbors killing their neighbors has been part of most genocides. Although I should say that, of course, the activists it was usually a mix. It was some outsiders, some people from Russia, or from communists from the Ukrainian cities, and sometimes mixed with local people who carried them out.
And how much would you say ideology and fomenting of hatred played a role?
So ideology is a I think for a long time we had the wrong idea about Stalinism, in that we thought when you read the very wooden language of the Bolsheviks, people said, well, they couldn't have possibly believed all that. It sounds absurd, the things that the way they talk and these Marxist cliches and so on. The more you read into the history of the Soviet Union, and I've now done it quite a bit, the more you read of Stalin's writings, how he was communicating with his sidekicks and his associates, the more you see that the ideology is actually very important. They do believe it. They are acting within what they believe to be its parameters. For example, it's very important to understand about Stalin that he believed that Marxism, or his version of Marxist-Leninism, wasn't just a theory; it was a science, and it was all true. And therefore, his interpretation of it was the correct interpretation of it was always his. When he decides to do collectivization, it's after he's thought about Marxism and he's interpreted it. This is what he decides is what Marxism is. And after he's declared that it's impossible ever to admit that it was a mistake. It can't be wrong. And therefore, if it's not working and if people are starving, then it's because there are saboteurs, there are wreckers, there are spies, there are enemies of the people, there are enemies of the state. They're all conspiring to undermine Marxism. But that doesn't mean I'm wrong. It means that they're enemies and we have to defeat them. And this attitude filters down in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of Soviet policies, not just in Ukraine, but you see it very much in the famine. The state has said, this is what's going to happen. This is going to make people rich. This is going to make us, there are going to be more crops and more food is going to be available. This policy is going to enlighten and enrich the countryside. And then when it doesn't happen, we need to explain why. And the reason that, and by the way, Soviet agricultural policy never worked. So they had these problems with food shortages from the very beginning. So we need someone to blame, and they blamed so-called kulaks, rich peasants. And the propaganda about the kulaks are hiding food from us. They're trying to stop our revolution. They're enemies of the people. They're spies. They're parasites. They're saboteurs. They're backwards. Was something that became, you would have read it in the newspapers every day. You would have talked about it all the time. Everybody knew that the kulaks were holding back the revolution. And when you hear some of there are very few, but they're very good memoirs of activists who took part both in collectivization and in the search campaigns, and they all say, they all talk about how they had believed this. Well, I got there and I thought, I am a real proletarian. I'm the vanguard of the revolution. You peasant with straw between your ears and your shoes made of cloth, you're trying to hold back us from progress, and you're keeping back the revolution from making gains. And we have to, history needs to abolish you so that we can make way for, this greater future. And the kulaks were very dispensable. We don't need these people holding us back. We can eliminate them. And that eliminationist language was also part of the, what Soviet propaganda would have been from the very beginning. And this, of course, if you wanted to also hear an echo in the present, this way of speaking is very, very divisive. We are the patriots, and our enemies are not just they don't just disagree with us, they're evil, they're scum, they have to be deleted, they have to be eliminated. I mean, this is something you can hear a little bit in Putinist language about Ukraine today. So in the olden days, the secret policemen were the patriots who were fighting against the enemies of the people, and now we have the patriotic Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine fighting against the fascists and the Nazis.
And you're not even mentioning the U.S.
Sorry?
And you don't even mention the U.S.
No, and these tactics, these divisive tactics where we demonize our enemies, are a characteristic of every authoritarian state that there has ever been. And the use of them in the United States, when that started in the presidential campaign last year, was what first made me aware that there was something wrong with this presidential election.
One last question. Oh, Frank is standing up. Maybe I'll squeeze it in. After all the testimony, you've probably read thousands of testimonies. You've gone through, I can't imagine how much archival evidence. And yet, is there some way in which it's still unfathomable that this could happen? It's not just ideology. Is it the confluence of ideology, Stalin's personality, and the world situation that this could have happened? Is there some way to you that it still seems impossible?
It's always hard to explain, how do you motivate, because essentially Stalin motivated thousands of people to kill their neighbors or to kill their fellow citizens, not just, by the way, the Ukrainian famine, but in other spheres. And it's always difficult to understand, why didn't people object to it? Why didn't they stop him? Why didn't some form of morality prevent this from happening? And you can explain it all you want, and you can come up with, you can talk about ideology, you can talk about propaganda, you can talk about hunger, you can talk about fear. Those are all very important parts of the explanation. But at the end of the day, yes, there is something mysterious, and why it is, particularly from our perspective. We live in these, democratic, prosperous times where it's hard for us to imagine something like that happening in our societies. And so projecting ourselves backwards, either into Stalin's 1930s or into today's North Korea, or into any one of a number of other horrible situations, is difficult. But I think it's important to try to do that, because it then helps us understand a little bit more about the darker side of human nature, and just be aware that this is possible and it can be done.
Thank you. I think we're ready for questions. Frank, you'll handle the Q&A.
Microphones, if we can take them around. Maybe what I propose to do is we would do this with 3 questions, group them, and then allow our speaker to answer them. While we're getting ready, and I see the first question over there, then I'll take the chair 2 and 3. All right, excuse me, let's find out if they're working. Okay, well, they're getting it.
Did you have some water?
No, not working.
Losing my voice.
No, okay. Yes?
Mine works.
Yes. You've got one there? Yeah? Okay, good. All right.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Okay, and may I just urge, make them questions and relatively short. If you would do that, we will be able to, I see many hands, and that would be very useful.
Very short question. How much did the Nazi Party learn from Stalin's work, not just in the famine, but in general with the camps and everything else?
Okay, and
Sorry,
then,
the Nazi Party.
yeah, and then we'll wait.
Nasty
on
Party.
3.
Nasty
Okay,
Party.
then here I have one, okay, wherever you see them here, Professor Lutsyuk, and then over here, Mr. Sherinian, then next.
Quick question, just could you comment on the cover-up by the British government of the famine?
Okay, and over here, and then.
I wanted to ask, in light of the Trump-Russia intrusion, how confident are you that both the political left and the right will see a wake-up call? Because it's not just Trump. We hear the rhetoric coming from people like Jill Stein as well, that are positions that are very pro-Kremlin. How confident are you that both political perspectives, which are being played by the Kremlin, will wake up and see that it's a strategy that's working on both sides of the political spectrum?
Okay, that's a remarkable distance of questions
Yeah.
now,
I
so
was
let
gonna
me do
Nazi-
those
Nazi
3
vote
done,
and
and then
Nazi
next over here to
British.
Mr.
Frank,
this
that's
gentleman
3.
here.
That's 3.
That's 3,
That's
yes.
3.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Nazis, clearly, the Nazi Party, and the Hitler and Stalin were they were doing many of the same things at the same time in the same part of the world, and they did know about one another, and they had some idea of what one another was doing. There's no sort of proof that Hitler studied what Stalin was doing or was especially inspired by one piece of this or another. I think that the historian Tim Snyder does suspect that Hitler knew that how the Ukrainian famine had worked, and then he, as most people don't remember, the first stage of the Holocaust was also essentially an artificial starvation. The Jews were locked into ghettos and then deprived of food. And Tim has made the link between these two events. I mean, we don't really know exactly what was known and wasn't known, but the more important issue is they were doing the same things at the same time to the same people. They had very similar feelings about Ukraine. I have a brief chapter in my book actually about the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, which happens soon after the famine, obviously. And the Nazis actually had a very open, they didn't even bother to hide it. Their intentions in Ukraine were to use it as a breadbasket and to starve Ukrainians. They talked about starving millions of Russians, and well, many people in Moscow will die because we're going to take all the grain and take it out of the country. This is called the Hunger Plan. So their intention towards those parts of the world were the same. But I don't think there's ever been any exact moment where Hitler says, "I'm copying Stalin." But there's certainly a relationship between the two at that moment. The British government is another interesting case. So British diplomats certainly knew about the famine, and they write back to London about it. Actually, one of them writes a note saying he's just talked to Walter Duranty, and they've been discussing the famine. And Mr. Duranty said to him, "Oh, well, I think some 10 million people might have died." And he says, "But unfortunately, Mr. Duranty hasn't chosen to share this observation with his American readers." That's one observation. The British then get the news, but they don't want to do anything about it. And it's kind of a complicated moment. It seems to be partly because they, the other important thing that's happening in 1933 is the rise of Hitler. And a lot of people in Europe are beginning to focus on that as the next coming threat. And the British, I think, have this idea that, well, we might need Stalin against Hitler, so we're not going to bring this up. They're actually also approached by some Ukrainian relief organizations who want to get food into Ukraine. Similar thing, by the way, happens, a very similar story at the Vatican, which also knows about the famine, also because of reports from priests and from people on the other side of the border in Poland who are sending letters to the Vatican. And they have a similar argument. Should we have a big relief effort? Should we talk about it? Should we promote it? And they also basically decide not to on similar grounds. There's a desire to, I don't know, whether it's mistaken idea that we can have Stalin on our side, or we can't do anything anyway, or Stalin will just reject this effort if we bring it up. But there is a huge hesitation on the part of those European governments that do know about it to do anything. And this is a marked contrast, remember, to 1920 and 21, when in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, There was also a starvation in the USSR, and there was a huge international effort to help starving Russians, as they were then called. And so it could have been done again, but the confluence of international affairs and the unwillingness of diplomats to respond this time also, I think, prevented that from happening. So there were, diplomats in Britain, Western journalists, actually diplomats, and there was a spectacularly good consul in Kharkiv from Italy who wrote these beautiful letters back to Rome describing everything that was happening. So there were a number of people who were writing about it, but it's an interesting study. But yet the subject never rose to the level of general knowledge, even though some people knew it. So it's an interesting study about what we know and when we know it. And then the third question was about Trump. Yes? Oh no.
Left and right.
Will we the left and the right? So this is a classic thing. The Russians actually do this in multiple countries. They seek out allies on the far left and the far right. They've done it much more effectively actually in Europe and a number of European countries where they've actually, the technique is not to invent things. So they don't invent, for example, Marine Le Pen, the nationalist leader in France. They just support her. And she had money from a Russian Czech bank. They don't create the far left, in Greece, but they, are friendly with it and they find ways to support that too. I think it's too early to say how the Trump-Russia scandal will go. I would hope that it would at least wake people up to the possibility that outside manipulation is now possible and very easy thanks to social media, which can be accessed anywhere in the world. It's a very bad idea to take a partisan attitude to this. Okay, so you're on the right and you think Trump is great, and so you don't want to hear about this manipulation. Well, okay, next time maybe it's going to be the Chinese electing Bernie Sanders. So, just because it's worked for your candidate this time doesn't mean it's not going to work for somebody else's candidate next time. And it's a much bigger problem than the problem of this one U.S. election. And it's something that needs more general thought. And that's actually my LSE project, but that's another story.
George.
You have called the Holodomor a genocide quite appropriately, I think. Yet the Holodomor has almost no presence in the field of genocide studies. Do you have any thoughts on why that might be?
You talked a little bit about stories that still need to be told about the Holodomor. I wonder what your research showed about Torgsons and their role in the Holodomor, where the money went to, who was in charge, etc.
Okay, well, yes. Okay, I'll go next.
Please comment on the numbers.
To the microphone, speak.
It's not work. Oh, there it goes. Could you make a comment about the numbers of victims? You had access to, to documents, and we see a range from 2 million, and I think the highest I've seen is 14 million. Are there any documents official documents that are showing that the parties that were involved in this action actually kept a tally by region by region? Is there anything out there?
Okay, that's three. I will go backwards actually, because there is a team of demographers in Ukraine who've been working for the last several years actually, going through regional archives and looking at birth and death rates, kind of province by province and county by county, who seem to have what are so far the best and really the only numbers that are based on this extensive research. And I used their numbers in my book. And the numbers they have are, it's basically 3.9, basically 4 million Ukrainians die of starvation. This is kind of unnatural deaths, so people who would, they do it by measuring death rates and they look for missing people. Because their argument actually, by the way, is that although cause of death was often altered and bodies were not recorded and so on, that more or less the local institutions had to know more or less how many people lived in their areas, and all kinds of things were based on those numbers, including, this was a central planning state, and so more or less they think these numbers are accurate. And anyway, the 3.94 million number of deaths between 1931 and 34 is the one that I used.
On the territory of Soviet.
On the territory of Soviet Ukraine, yeah. I mean, and sorry, I should add that there's a higher number for the entire famine. So remember, the Ukrainian famine is a famine within the famine. There's a broader Soviet famine that is, also is taking place at the same time. And the numbers for that are sort of 5 to 6 million. I mean, the total number is 5 to 6 million. And then within that famine, there's a specific thing that happens in Ukraine, and it's caused by the decisions of 1932. And the numbers for that are, you get, approximately 4 million. So that's that number. Okay, so the Torgsons, there is a chapter on it in the book. There's a section on it. This is another very sort of sinister way in which Stalin exploited the peasants during the famine. The Torgsons were hard currency shops, and so anybody could go to a Torgson and they could take hard currency. They were actually originally set up for tourists, but you could, during the famine, in the famine years, their remit was expanded, and anybody who basically had any gold jewelry, any silver jewelry, any Tsarist era medals could take them to one of these shops and exchange their jewelry for food. And something like 1,500 of these shops were set up all over Ukraine, and they seem to have been deliberately designed. We know the peasants are starving. Let's get their gold. And this was briefly, in that year and the year that followed, a huge part of Soviet hard currency, money that was used for export. I don't have the number in my head, but it's in the book. The big chunk of Soviet hard currency earnings came from peasants. I mean, and this is literally, people digging in there, looking for family heirlooms and jewelry and wedding rings, giving them to the state in exchange for flour. And lots of people have written about how they survived thanks to these hard currency shops. But in a way, they're almost the most cynical story that you can find connected to the famine, because that is another indication that the state knew that people were hungry and knew that people would give up whatever they had in exchange for food. And they expand these shops all over Ukraine right at this moment for exactly that reason. And so the Torgsons are described. There's actually quite a lot of research that's been done on them, some of which I think you published or you translated.
And we will be publishing it.
And you're going to publish it more. Yeah, there's a collection of new research, and that's very much in the book. And the third question was about the genocide. So there's a section there's a chapter in the book which talks about a number of issues of the Holodomor and history and memory in Ukraine, and which talks very specifically about. I also speak very specifically about the genocide question. There is no doubt in my mind that particularly if you look at the definition of genocide as it was conceived by Raphael Lemkin, who's this Polish Jewish lawyer who invented the word, and his idea was that genocide meant, the deliberate destruction of a group or nation or ethnicity, in order to eliminate them as a group or a nation or ethnicity. And I have no problem applying that term to Ukraine in the early 1930s, particularly because, as we actually haven't really discussed yet, the famine was accompanied by an assault on Ukrainian intellectuals, artists, writers, museum curators, all kinds of other people were also part. There was a major purge of the Ukrainian national elite that happened at the same time, carried out by the same people. And I think very much that the Ukraine in this period fits into that definition. The word genocide, as it came to be defined in international law, and remember that international law in the 40s was written with the help of the Soviet Union, is a little narrower, and it's not even really in the language of the UN documents, but it came to be understood as something like what Hitler did to the Jews. In other words, the attempt to destroy every single member of a group. And the Ukrainian famine is not that. Not every Ukrainian was killed, and that doesn't seem to have been what Stalin's intention was, but clearly his intention was to weaken the peasants, to prevent rebellion from happening, but also to eliminate the possibility of a sovereign national Ukraine, to take away Ukrainian identity, to dilute it so that Ukraine becomes Sovietized and part of the Soviet Union. But because of the way the legal documents were written, it's become harder to classify Ukraine as a genocide. I mean, that's really no excuse for why people doing genocide studies don't study it, because they're not bound by the terms of the UN Convention on Genocide. So actually, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, maybe it hasn't been written about enough. Maybe there's not enough. Maybe there's not enough material on it. But I mean, it certainly belongs in that category. Why it happened, how it happened, what was the motivation of the people who carried it out? What were the long-term effects on it? I mean, those are the questions we ask about other genocides, and it seems to me this one should be in that list.
Okay, so 1, 2, and 3, and then Mr. Romanescu.
I'll piggyback a little bit on the last question. I just finished reading your book yesterday, and thank you very much. I thought it was a very good compilation of facts that we all knew about in different pieces, but you put it very eloquently together in a very readable format. So thank you very much for your work in that regard. Everything that you said in your book from the beginning to the end follows to a logical conclusion, in my opinion, that this was actually a genocide. Lemkin's definition of genocide and this one is, and what happened here is identical. The definition of what you said in the 1940s, 80 years ago or more, the Soviets had a little trouble with the word genocide for obvious reasons, which you know about. It would be really appreciated if you had come in and said, in spite of the 1940s, that what happened back then, this is a genocide.
I think I do say that. Shall I read you the passage?
Yes, please.
It's in the book.
All right, that will be the answer. And then the next question, please. Yes?
Yes, it sort of expands on Ljubomir's question. The connection between Soviet exports of grain stocks, imports to the United States during the Dust Bowl, and subsequent recognition of the Soviet Union, diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union, along with entrance into the League of Nations. And if you could comment on those links, or are they links? Or
I'm not sure I understood that. I'm sorry. The
so,
links between the Dust Bowl?
So the Americans import Soviet grain stocks.
Right.
Stalin's exporting during this time. Do you believe he was exporting for the reason of currying favor with the West? And
no, he was exporting to make money. I mean, to fund industrialization.
But do you think it was an added bonus that he got diplomatic recognition and then entrance into the League of Nations shortly after?
I'll answer that in a second. You want to do some questions?
There was a woman here, yes, and then Mr. Romanescu here. We'll take 4 this time, and then down here.
Hi, my question will be a little repetitive. I'd also like to start by saying that I'm a great admirer of your work. And I follow you religiously
Closer
on
to the
Twitter.
microphone. Okay.
Okay. My question is with respect to the legal definition of genocide. Article 2 of the UN Convention of Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide states, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, et cetera, et cetera. I'm, even under your, I'm sorry, I suffer from bad nerves. I'm going to ask you to.
Oh, it's okay.
No problem, I will overtake. And basically,
I think I know
there
where
are
you're going,
16 governments around the world, right? And parliaments that recognize the Holodomor as genocide. And, they don't have a problem with the legal definition. I am, as a lawyer with lots of, legal background, don't have a problem with UN definition, but somehow in your book, you have a problem with the modern day definition. And I would just like to know, why were you compelled to say that? Why were you compelled to pass a judgment, on the...
Okay, well, I think we'll then group them, and then we'll deal with the genocide in a second, okay? And then Mr. Romanescu, and then
Thank you.
And then we'll go back on the answer, okay?
Stalin issued many directives about the famine within the famine, as you aptly put it. Which one between, say, August 1932 and January 1933, which one of those documents or directives would you consider the smoking gun as far as the using the famine within the famine as a weapon.
Okay.
So the first question was about recognition of the Soviet Union. So my book isn't about that, and I haven't made an extensive study about the recognition of the Soviet Union. As far as I know, it didn't have that much to do with grain exports. It was more to do with Roosevelt's sense that there was something important. I mean, based actually maybe largely on Walter Duranty's reporting, that there was something important happening in the Soviet Union, and that this was a big. He had this thing about the similarity between the U.S. and Russia, that we are somehow the new countries as opposed to this old Europe, and that we must, somehow we're moving into the future and Europe is in the past. He says that to Churchill at some point during the war afterwards. No, during the war. He died afterwards. And so my understanding was that the reason for recognition was really more to do with diplomacy rather than just to do with grain. And also, as far as I remember, and I could be misremembering, so don't quote me, but as far as I remember, the grain exports were mostly not to the U.S., but mostly to other European countries. So I don't think that was a big factor in the decision. But again, not a subject I've studied at any great length. So the genocide question. So most lawyers who worked on this subject, understood from the, it's not just what's in the UN Convention, it's what is the conversation around the UN Convention, what kinds of, legal decisions are being taken, understood that the definition of genocide was something like what the Nazis did in Germany. And if you hear people, when they argue against the idea that the Ukrainian famine was a genocide, that's usually what they say. They say, well, he wasn't trying to kill all the Ukrainians, and Hitler tried to kill all the Jews. And somehow this piece of the definition, which is how it's just how that law has been interpreted by a lot of people, seems to be one of the things that has held back the idea that of recognition of Ukraine as a genocide. I would say that another important reason is that first the Soviet Union, and then more importantly in the last 20 years Russia, have been incredibly active politically in preventing the Ukrainian famine from being recognized as a genocide, and have gone around. I mean, there's actually an example in the book of Azerbaijan, I think it is a country that has been specifically pressured by the Russians, who say we'll stop helping you in your war against Armenia if you, or stop trading with you if you recognize Ukraine as a genocide, the Ukrainian famine as a genocide. So the pressure that Russia has put on many, I think that's actually the real explanation, is the politics of genocide have been more important than anything else. I remember that international law is what the nations of the world decide it is. I mean, and it can evolve and change. And it is certainly possible that it will evolve in such a way that enough people agree that the Ukrainian famine is a genocide, and then it will. But until now, the it's not my job to, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not an advocate. I'm explaining why it hasn't been recognized until now, and I think the reason is that the way the statute was interpreted after the war made that difficult. It made it harder under international law to recognize. By the definition, as I understand it, as Lemkin understood it, and as most of us here understand it, of course it's a genocide. So that's what I think.
Was this question answered?
Smoking
yes.
gun.
Oh, smoking gun.
Yeah.
So no, there isn't a smoking gun. I mean, there isn't one document that you can point to that says, there is no moment where Stalin says, let's kill the Ukrainians, or let's kill the peasants. He doesn't say that. Mind you, Hitler never says that about the Jews either. So that's in that sense, the situations are similar. The argument of the book is that there's this series of decisions in the autumn of 1932, and then there are the search teams that go into Ukraine in that winter, and that's the and then there's the spike in deaths in 1933, which you have in Ukraine and nowhere else, and that explanation is that's the That's the sort of Ukrainian part of the famine. And so, but there isn't a piece of paper or a statement that you can point to. I mean, there's some interesting things that Stalin said, including there's an exchange of letters between him and a famous Soviet writer, in which the Sholokhov, who writes to him and says, he's from Kuban, actually, from the region next to Ukraine, which has a lot of Ukrainian speakers in it and is also subject to some similar kinds of searches. And he gets a letter from Sholokhov who says there's been this terrible starvation, and Stalin writes back and says something like, well, because it's Sholokhov, he says, well, okay, I'll send some aid to your local village, but I just want you to remember that, you feel sorry for these kulaks, but actually they deserve to die, and, you don't know the full story. Actually, these are people trying to undermine our revolution. In so many words. I mean, those are not exact quotes. And this is a moment where you see Stalin actively acknowledging that there's been a famine and that, yeah, the people who are dying deserve to die. And so this kind of language and this kind of conversation is another way in which you can conclude that this was an artificial famine. But
now, I want to assure that we have ample time for you to purchase the book and get it signed. And that means this will be our last round of 3 questions, and please make them short. So Professor Darevich, I see, was here. And yes, and okay, and then we will move up here, and then, okay.
I'd like you to comment on 2 points. One has to do with something you've mentioned, the Kuban.
Kuban. Kuban.
It's an area largely populated by Ukrainians, and it was, as far as I know, the only other segment which was surrounded like Ukraine, and people were not allowed to exert.
It's Ukrainians and Cossacks.
Yeah. Well, but many of the Cossacks.
Many of them were Ukrainian, not all of them. But the Cossacks were another problem.
Nevertheless, that was a region which was treated very similar to the Soviet Republic. And I think if you included the deaths there, which as I understand it were over 1 million, that would change the figures quite a bit. The other question I'd like to ask you now, as far as I know, the reporting on the famine in Ukraine by the consulates of the various governments, these included, of course, largely Poland. Then there was the Italians, which you've mentioned. There were the Germans. British, although they didn't really have consulates outside of Russia, I think.
No, but they had some people traveling around.
Yeah. And then the Germans. And I find it unusual that none of those countries made information about that famine public. In fact, the Mussolini explicitly made a note not to make the reports public, which, as you mentioned, are very interesting by the Italian consulate. I find it also very difficult to understand that the US, with their excellent government facilities and press and everything, acted as if they knew absolutely nothing about it. I mean, there was lots of things in the Canadian press in the 30s about the famine. So could you comment on those things?
Okay, and then down here, please. We have.
How did Ukraine recover of this famine? I mean, we were talking about 4 million people, and in my Canadian, and especially peasants and farmers, and in my Canadian mind, 4 million people or families, it's almost like if we would empty all our prairies, provinces in Western Canada. So, what was the process afterwards?
Okay, and this fellow will be on.
Were your previous experiences working, and particularly writing other books, did that influence the writing of this book? And if so, how?
So the first question was about foreign countries. Yes, all those countries you mentioned did know about the famine. The U.S., remember, at that time did not have a relationship with Russia and didn't have any diplomats in Russia, I mean, in the Soviet Union. And so, you know, I mean, literally most of the information in the U.S. came from Walter Duranty. And so I think that explains the absence of an American reaction until much later. The Germans actually did speak about the famine. I mean, not so much at the time, but slightly later it became a piece of German propaganda, Nazi propaganda, actually. But you know, remember what a crisis year 1933 was. I mean, so Hitler had just taken over Germany, and there was total chaos in the foreign ministries in many countries, and particularly in the Germany. You know, Mussolini was probably not interested in having I think the most important point is that nobody wanted to fight with Stalin at that particular moment. Or nobody wanted to contradict him. Nobody wanted to say anything that would cause a reaction. People were also, I think, beginning to be frightened of him, and being frightened of the Soviet Union as a negative force, and beginning to understand a little bit of what Stalinism was. That would be my, again, I haven't made an extensive study of the politics of every country towards Russia. So, I mean, Poland even more so. The Poles would have been, were very conscious of everything that was going on inside the Soviet Union. Actually, I mean, somewhat earlier, the Poles had, as you probably know, their foreign policy what had been to promote Ukrainian independence. And their Pilsudski's idea from the very beginning was that if there was an independent sovereign Ukraine, if there was a strong Ukrainian national movement, that would, you know, be good for Poland, and that would, you know, balance out the, you know, the Bolsheviks. But I think by 1933, they were wary of the geopolitics or the European politics of the region, and they were anxious about angering Stalin. And again, you know, there were, because of the distraction of Hitler, because, you know, I'm not making excuses for anybody. I'm guessing that this was the attitude was, okay, there's this terrible thing happening, but there are a lot of terrible things happening, and it's not really our role right now to speak out. And remember, the Poles had just signed a peace agreement with the Russians, with the Soviet Union. And so this was a moment when, for a lot of other reasons, people didn't want to anger Stalin. And that doesn't speak well of anybody, you know, and it doesn't speak well of people's humanity or their you know, but that seems to have been the reality of that particular moment. That's the best explanation I can give. What was the other question? It was about, oh, what happened afterwards? Well, I mean, there were empty villages in Ukraine, and as one of the other, there's a whole chapter on the aftermath. One of the things that happened in the Soviet Union was that people from outside of Ukraine, very often Russians, were brought into the villages. So the villages were repopulated by outsiders. And this has been understood in subsequent years as another attempt to Russify Ukraine. And one of the longer-term policies that the Soviet Union had towards Ukraine was this longer-term idea of slow Russification. It's a complicated story. Many of those people who were moved in later on left. Others took their places. But there are large areas of Ukraine which are now Russian-speaking, which would have been Ukrainian-speaking in earlier history. And this is partly why. So the long-term impact of losing that number of people was to enhance and speed up the Russification of Ukraine. And that, you know, that may even have been one of the motivations that Stalin had for doing this. You know, there are all kinds of longer-term complicated effects that the famine had on Ukraine. I actually think the famine plus this destruction of the leadership class had an effect of making people wary of the state in Ukraine, you know, erasing any kind of trust there might ever have been between ordinary people and the government. You know, it's really extraordinary. To this day, Ukraine is a country that's unbelievably good at creating civic movements. I mean, fantastically well organized, beautifully executed civic events and movements and people, and it's not very good at creating state institutions. And it's had that problem for a long time, and it's and there's a way in which the famine is part of the explanation. You know, that people are simply wary of the state, even in a democratic state. You know, are those people who work for the government, are they really us? Are we loyal to them? are they going to try and take advantage of us? Are they really the same as us? I think it explains a lot of the modern kind of political pathologies in Ukraine. I mean, I think the famine had a very profound long-term effect on Ukrainian society, creating this atmosphere of fear, creating a lot of sensitivity about the Ukrainian language, people being afraid to use it, afraid to promote it, people being afraid to be too Ukrainian because that could lead to terrible consequences. I think if you were to look back over the last 80 years, you would, you can see an enormous psychological and demographic long-term effect, which I talk about a little. And now the third question was, how did my other books affect this book? Goodness. I don't know, I suppose, writing any book helps you to write the next book. Some of the issues in this book are ones that I encountered previously. So I first met the kulaks, for example, in my book on the Gulag, because they arrive in the camps in 1932. They're expelled from their farms during collectivization, and there's this enormous expansion of the concentration camps that happens because of them. They get there, and that's the first expansion of the Gulag system right after collectivization. And so I had sort of met them before and heard them described and learned about them in that context. And then seeing them again in this context was, it was kind of added another layer of understanding. I think my previous book, which was about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, which had some things in common with the Sovietization of Ukraine, but was different, also helped me understand what was the purpose of the Sovietization of Ukraine, and some of the ways of thinking, the elimination of the national elite, creation of terror, elimination of independent institutions. In the case of Ukraine, it was all very primitive, but it was the churches and the national, national institutions, museums, and so on. That was part of a pattern that there had been established actually by the Sovietization of Ukraine, then carried on into Central Europe in a little bit more sophisticated form after the war. So I'd kind of encountered aspects of the story before. I think that helped me understand what was going on. I mean, and then there's the issue, once you have kind of worked in the Soviet archives and you've seen how they worked and you figure out how people talk, how they, once you've gotten used to seeing these protocols of meetings, it becomes easier to understand what they really mean and how, you begin to see echoes of things and find familiar. I mean, I actually feel that I've spent a lot of time in the last decade kind of inside the heads of Bolsheviks or people writing up, attending these meetings. That is actually my last book about Stalin, just 'cause I just don't want to be with him anymore. I don't want to think about him anymore. I've had enough of it. But no, absolutely, my books feed into one another, and actually, in a way, my journalism feeds into the books too, sometimes in very odd ways. Marta referred to this subject of modern disinformation. Well, yes, I was thinking about that while I was writing the book, and how language gets twisted and used in politics is something I worry about now, and I also worry about in the 1930s. And so, I mean, in my head, a lot of these things are very interconnected.
Now, I think we can say we have the good fortune that Professor Applebaum devoted the last of her Stalin trilogy to the Holodomor to produce a magnificent work. I think she, on the other hand, however, would agree that it is not ever the last word. That is, there still is an immense amount of work that can be done on the Holodomor. If you are interested in what the HREC does, please go on our website, www.holodomor.ca, and you will find, I think, a considerable amount of material, and that material will be, I think, increasing in the future. Now, Professor Applebaum accused me a bit of giving a long-winded introduction. However,
no, I mean, it was over-flattering.
However, I would say I did leave out some crucial elements from that introduction, such as that she is the co-author of a cookbook from a Polish country house kitchen, which I recommend you go out to find. And her travelogue between East and West across the borderlands of Europe has recently been reprinted. printed. So somehow talking about the kitchen before the Holodomor discussion didn't seem quite right, but it is a wonderful book. So please go out and get it as well. What I would also say is we are also very fortunate to have someone of such civic courage who devoted a book to the Holodomor. We will be seeing, the reviews so far have been overwhelmingly very positive. We discussed this at lunch, and I said, yes, but that's the general reviewer. The academic reviewer comes later in the journals. We will get more nitpicking, and this will go on. It is still a civic courage to undertake such a large project that also relates, as we have seen in our questioning, not just to Ukraine of 1932-33, but to Ukraine of today, to all kinds of memory politics. And this book will have a tremendous impact on it. And we're also fortunate for her journalist career and the writings that we read in the Washington Post at a time when I think many of us are uneasy about the structure of institutions, the rise of dangerous movements. History will not repeat, but history can teach. And this book can teach a tremendous amount. Please rush out, get it, come back in and sign it, and join me in thanking Professor Applebaum for her.